Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bao Loc Wash Process Vietnam from Pallet Coffee Roasters. And there's the cup right there. And this is part 2 of our 6-part Vancouver review series, and I'm currently outside of the Knight and Kingsway location. And this is the first time Pallet has ever appeared on this channel, although they are a coffee roaster I have a pretty extensive familiarity with. First thing I wanted to say is apologies for any sort of background noise, as this is my first time at this location, and apparently it's a very busy intersection. But let's discuss Pallet real quick, as I first discovered this coffee roaster from a local coffee blog called Vancouver Coffee Snob. So I wanted to give that blog a shout out, as it's a blog I've been using for a number of years, ever since the first time I came up to Vancouver, and they spoke very highly of this coffee roaster, and as a result I went to the shop for the first time, the very first time I ever visited Vancouver, and it turned out to be one of the better coffee roasters I experienced while I was out here. So from that point going forward, I would usually visit their headquarters, which is a little further north, or their downtown location. In fact, I was actually at their downtown location yesterday, and they served me a Kenyan coffee that I quite enjoyed. So they're a coffee roaster I visit every single time I am out in Vancouver. Let's discuss the way that their cafes work, and in the case of this shop right here, they did have 2 pour-overs and a batch brew. Their batch brew was their holiday blend, however their pour-over options, both of which were V60s. One was an anaerobic natural processed Indonesian coffee, and while that was interesting because I don't think I've actually ever reviewed an Indonesian coffee on this channel, it was maybe a little too heavy for me this early in the morning. This is actually my first cup of coffee of the day. But this one right here is also a Vietnamese coffee, which we have never reviewed on this channel either, so this felt like a great opportunity to do so. Alright, let's discuss the roast profile for this coffee real quick, and I don't know if they actually had any sort of listing for it, but this one right here definitely has a little bit more development to it in general. For the most part, a lot of these coffee roasters do tend to fall in line with that sort of light medium spectrum for a lot of coffees in general. This one right here definitely feels like it has a slight bit more development, but maybe not to the extent that you might expect for something of this origin. So just keep that in mind, a little bit more developed on that light medium side in terms of the roast profile. But let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And the first impression I really had of this coffee was that it came out so much more sweet than I was expecting, but it was kind of this sweet spice sort of experience. And I'm like, okay, I was kind of expecting a more fruit forward cup, as the descriptors they had for this coffee were sweet citrus, subtle berries, and chocolate. And I'm like, I'm probably going to get a fair bit of the chocolate, and that was very much the case. However, the most dominant and defining aspect of this coffee was a very strong spice component to it. Right from the start, as soon as I took that first sip, I'm like, okay, this actually has a very sweet component to it. Probably some chocolate. It was actually more of a kind of candied sweetness. I'm thinking like a brown candy, like a caramel, butterscotch sort of thing. However, then it finished with a very spice-like finish, and that continued to permeate throughout the cup. And as it cooled down, the spice really did seem to kind of explode. There's so much spice present within this coffee, which is definitely not what I was necessarily expecting going into it. Some additional components, as I mentioned, the sweeter aspect seems to come from this kind of butterscotch, caramel, brown candy component. There's a fair bit of chocolate present as well. That's the one flavor note I could definitely agree with. And it's not necessarily an overly acidic or bright coffee, but it has a little bit of a citric component to it as well. So it just kind of makes this interestingly unique roundabout coffee experience, and at the warmer temperatures it's really, really sweet with that really sweet spice to it, and then as it cools down it really just seems to kind of go in a more interesting savory spice direction. Alright, we have the notes. Let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Alright, and we have one level 5, so we'll discuss that real quick, which is the finish. And yes, so as I kind of mentioned, it has this interesting spice to it, and I wish I was better at identifying spice, but I don't drink a whole lot of coffees that have specific spice to them. It's, yeah, just kind of like a more baker's spice sort of thing, like a shelf of spices. I don't really know, but it's a very long-lasting spice component within this coffee. A bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness. Sweetness level 4, right at the onset, it is a very sweet cup of coffee. It's not necessarily a sweetness that I do enjoy, though. It's a little bit of this kind of murky spice chocolate sweetness to it. So right at the start, not necessarily my favorite. As I mentioned, as it does cool down, you get a little bit more of this kind of brown candy butterscotch sort of taste to it. But right from the onset, not necessarily my favorite. Level 4 for the spice, that's one thing I mentioned. While I've said that it's very pronounced in the finish, and it might be the most defining flavor profile in this coffee for me, it is not necessarily overly overbearing, even if at times it can be long-lasting. It still doesn't reach the levels that we've had some spice for other coffees, like very cinnamon-forward cups of coffee. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, that's one of the other things, one of the few things that they have listed on the bag that I felt in significant abundance. Definitely felt a fair bit of chocolate in this one. Definitely more on the milk chocolate side of things. Caramel level 4. I mentioned that there's a fair bit of this kind of butterscotch brown candy component in this coffee, so that's what that hints towards. And savoriness level 4. Yeah, that's a little bit more for the spice. It has this interesting savory spice. That's probably the words I'm using to describe this spice within this coffee. Body level 4, definitely quite textured, has a fair bit of body to it, even brewed through the V60. That might be something I could have expected going into this. I wish I knew a little bit more about this coffee. I think it's just a mixed varietal coffee from Vietnam, so I think there's only so much you might be able to trace back with this coffee. But yeah, it has a lot more texture to it. I wish I just kind of knew a little bit more background about it. And then we have a bunch of level 3s. I think the only things I really want to focus on for those level 3s are the, well, fruits. We'll start with the citrus. And I mentioned that there's a slight citric component present within this coffee. But it's not an overly acidic coffee. That's why the acidity stays kind of low at that level too. I think that just kind of goes with the origin in this one and probably the way that they roasted this coffee. And then the other fruit components, the berry at a level 2. They said subtle berries on this coffee, and I wasn't picking up too much berry component within this one. If it was present, it was very much in the background, not necessarily the most pronounced thing. And then the last thing I'll discuss is the cleanliness level 3. And while this is a washed coffee that, you know, it's void of any sort of funkiness, fermentiness, booziness sort of thing, at the same time, it doesn't have a very clear and distinct profile. And I think a lot of that comes from this murky sort of spice component present within this coffee. So yeah, that's the tasting wheel. Obviously no adjustments given that I just made this tasting wheel. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I was curious going into it, given that I'd never reviewed a Vietnamese coffee on this channel. I have had Vietnamese coffees before, and they typically aren't necessarily my favorite because I feel like it's one of those origins where there's still a lot of work to be done before it reaches the same level as a lot of its contemporaries, and for that reason I didn't have a whole lot of high hopes going into it. Although the flavor profile sounded very much like something I might enjoy, it went in a completely opposite direction of what I was expecting, so for that reason this one wasn't necessarily my favorite either. As I mentioned, I really enjoy Pallet and a lot of the things that they do offer, and I highlighted a Kenyan that I had yesterday. That was a very good Kenyan, and in hindsight it would have been fun to review that Kenyan coffee, but at least now we have a Vietnamese coffee reviewed on this channel. A little different from what I was expecting, and I guess that'll transition us into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It had some really nice things. So the body, which never is a huge important factor for me, had a fair bit of texture to it. So that's the first place I would start if you do enjoy your kind of complex spice components within coffee. This one has that in abundance with a very long-lasting finish. At the same time, you do get some very subtle fruits, so that with a slightly more developed profile and a unique origin could make for a very interesting drink for a lot of people as well. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bao Loc wash process Vietnam from Pallet Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.